good evening to you both. And let's begin with the Premier tempering her tone over the state of Trump tariffs. In a panel discussion with the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, Danielle Smith says she isn't celebrating.
I don't want to be exuberant about dodging the bullet because we have our friends who are heavily invested, obviously, in steel and aluminum and the auto sector who are going to be hurt.
That is a change from a social media post Wednesday when she called the tariffs announcement an important win for Canada and Alberta, adding it appears the worst of the tariff dispute is behind us.
I'm astounded and disappointed that a premier in Canada would call that a big win. We are going to see hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in Canada, and we are going to see the U.S. economy go into a recession. That is going to hurt everyone, including Alberta.
In response to the U.S. trade action, Canada is hitting back with its own targeted measures and protections for sectors hit hardest.
I would say that all of the provinces, all of the premiers, are very supportive of the measured response.
She's very good at communicating to the people she's speaking to, not understanding when you're the premier of the province, there's a whole bunch of eavesdroppers.
As Canada rolls out retaliation, some of the biggest automakers are already announcing layoffs and shutdowns. Ellen, what do you make of the premier's change of tone one day after declaring a big win for Alberta and Canada?
Yeah, well, you know, her tone originally was positive, talking about CUSMA, because of course that includes oil and gas. And in Alberta, that's an important, positive component. But of course, overall, she is, upset, and it's a negative tone as it relates to Canada as a whole, because obviously our economy is going to be hugely impacted. But specifically with oil and gas and CUSMA, I think that's where that note of the positive tone applied. But overall, of course, it is a negative. The tariffs are negative in general.
Tyler, how do you see Danielle Smith factoring into further conversation around Team Canada response to the ongoing trade and tariffs threats?
I think it'll depend quite a bit on what she decides to do next. I mean, is she going to continue to travel to the United States and sort of engage in her own diplomacy? What are the meetings that she's going to be having with other premiers, whoever the eventual prime minister is at the end of this election, that sort of thing. So I think it's a little bit up in the air right now what sort of influence she's going to have. I mean, I think probably at this point it looks like Ontario's Doug Ford is going to be sort of the person who ends up being at the forefront of this just by virtue of the fact that there are the auto tariffs, whereas some of the industries in other parts of the country, including Alberta, are less affected. But certainly it'll be, I think, a question of what her sort of ongoing diplomacy looks like, maybe less so perhaps than the things that she is saying, in speeches and in news releases and things like that.
Ellen, on that point, what do you think Albertans are expecting of the role Danielle Smith will play, the tone she will take moving forward?
Well, her tone has been different from the other premiers here in Canada. It's been more diplomatic. As we saw, she went as sort of our CEO of our province. She's trying to kind of at least be perceived as she's building relationships and trying to get a little bit into the inner workings of the decision makers down south, as we've seen. So she has had more of a diplomatic approach. Her tone has been a bit different for sure. And I think that's positive from an Alberta perspective.
All right. As the tariffs turmoil plays out, a former federal politician from our province has triggered some turmoil of his own. In a Globe and Mail column, Preston Manning writes that if the Liberals win the election, Western provinces may decide to separate, including Alberta, Saskatchewan, and possibly parts of BC, Manitoba, and the Territories. The former Reform Party leader says Canadians, especially in Atlantic Canada, need to realize the consequences of their votes, and that if elected, Mark Carney could end up in the history books as the last prime minister of a united Canada.
Where does he get the idea that Saskatchewan and Alberta want to leave anyway? I mean, the polls tell us it's about 10% of the population. On a good day, I have to wonder what Mr. Manning was thinking when he wrote this. And this will not help the chances of the Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre, at the national level.
The federal Conservative leader says he does not agree with Preston Manning's claims. Pierre Poilievre says he wants to unite the country after nearly a decade under the Liberals and to stand up to the U.S. threat. Tyler, what's your read on the depth or even the drive behind separatism sentiment here in Alberta at the moment?
I have no idea. I mean, this was all pretty obvious. The source of all this was pretty obvious, it was 6 or 7 years ago when we were talking about the carbon tax and Bill C-69 and Bill C-48 and, various pipeline cancellations. At that point, all the grievances that Alberta had and the way they were leading to this sort of high watermark of alienation, probably the highest it had polled since, the National Energy Program years, that all made a lot of sense. I don't know where this is coming from right now. I mean, if you look at the polls, more people are planning to vote for the Liberal Party in Alberta than would vote for separation. If you run sort of compare and contrast the poll numbers, I have no idea where this is coming from. You have to think it's just probably, I mean, there's always been this sort of group of super agitated people who've wanted this sort of thing and who've talked about precipitating a national unity crisis. And you have to think that maybe Preston is in contact with these people or talking to them a bunch, or just maybe runs in very different social circles than the other, 5 or so million of us. So I mean, I'm at a loss. I'd love, if anyone has an answer, I'd love to know what it is, because I don't know where it's coming from.
Well, Ellen, how do you see this sentiment playing at a time when a significant threat looms large south of the border?
Well, I guess, I mean, even in circles that I run in Calgary with various clients, I do hear people feeling very frustrated. Like I had mentioned when we talked about this earlier, I'm not sure about separatism as the answer. However, division has grown significantly in the last 10 years, more than ever here in Canada. And we have a federal government now who's promising the same policies as we've seen with Bill C-69 and industrial emissions cap and all of these things. So, there is frustration. Separatism, like we've talked about, is different, but division is a serious thing, and it's not good for Canada. And people are very frustrated, and I think it's a fair thing to recognize here.
Tyler, this rise of talk of separatism in terms of drawing attention to our province, how much of a national issue do you see this evolving into through the remainder of the election?
I don't think I see it being a national issue at all, honestly. The reality is that nobody needs Alberta or Saskatchewan to win this election. The Conservatives certainly can't afford to lose all of those seats, but this election is going to be won or lost in the mainland, lower mainland of British Columbia and the Greater Toronto area. And that's just the population-based electoral reality. This is only going to be an issue, I think, in a handful of races, a direct issue, I should say. But then the other way it could be an issue, and I don't mean that in the way that Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre are going to have to talk about it every day. I do mean in the sense that if you are a GTA voter or a voter in Atlantic Canada, are you sitting there and thinking, gosh, I better vote for my Conservative candidate because otherwise Alberta and Saskatchewan are going to throw this massive tantrum and leave the country? I mean, I just think that's an unlikely way for anyone to end up casting their ballot, and an unlikely motivation for it. So I think we'll continue to hear about it, but I don't expect it to be, a major issue that sways the outcome of the election.
Some welcome relief for motorists this week. That's because of the disappearance of consumer carbon pricing.
Now we see a pause and a reduction, essentially, of that 17.6 cents a liter. So it's going to mean that Canadians virtually coast to coast are going to pay hundreds of dollars less per year on gasoline with those big savings.
Pump prices dropped overnight April 1st, with some stations in the Edmonton area going as low as $1.21 per liter.
We're looking at $80 for half a tank, so about $40 cheaper altogether.
Things are tight for groceries and fuel and everything, so it'll help them lots.
Mark Carney moved to cancel the consumer carbon tax shortly after being sworn in as Prime Minister last month.
We're pleased that finally the federal government succumbed to the immense pressure by our government, other provincial governments, the federal opposition leader, and have done the right thing and eliminated that tax.
It will also, though, result in the elimination of the carbon rebate, with final checks to arrive April 22nd.
For most middle class and lower income Canadians, the loss of that rebate will be pretty heavy relative to the decrease in the price at the pump.
And while consumer pricing is gone for now, large emitters are still taxed through the industrial levy. Ellen, technically the C-tax is paused for now, still needs to be made permanent by Parliament. Of course, Parliament on pause now while politicians campaign. How much of a role do you expect this to have in the outcome of the election?
Yeah, it's interesting. Carney has taken basically what Pierre Poilievre promised, and it's a little bit misleading because we do have this industrial carbon tax. So it may be a bit less expensive at the pump or with our home heating bills. However, we're still seeing a rise in cost of our goods through the industrial carbon tax. So that's a little bit misleading, I think.
Tyler, instant savings at the pump now, to Ellen's point. Home heating bills also to be going down soon. But how much do you think Canadians are going to miss the carbon rebate checks?
I think I'll miss it, mainly because it's fun money, right? It's like your tax return. You don't think that much about that money until you get it back, or until you have to pay it, in the case of my tax return this year, which is a whole other story. But I think people, by and large, weren't really sure what it was and didn't really think that much about it. And that's why you saw the rebranding of it in, I think it was 2022, when the Liberals changed the name of it and tried to sort of get a little bit more public awareness of it. So I'm not actually certain that people are going to notice that much. I mean, I think those that really paid attention to it may, but I think people are probably more likely to experience that daily feedback at the pumps or their monthly feedback when they get their home heating bill, as opposed to, sort of quarterly thinking about the $250 or whatever they didn't get.
And Ellen, how confident are you the consumer carbon tax is gone for good?
I don't know. I mean, they'll find another tax and change the name of it to continue to speak to that narrative and participate in looking at environmental issues and responding to some of those needs and those requests. So I think we may see something just in a different form, to be honest with you.
All right, that'll be something post-election. All right, for us, one more topic. That's making it easier for neurodivergent travelers to take flight. Airports, often congested, noisy places, and for some, that can be overwhelming.
Families just simply aren't traveling because of that anxiety, that stress that is involved with being at an airport, getting on a flight. And so this really was born from those conversations.
This being a sanctuary of sorts at the Edmonton Airport, with soft sounds, calming visuals, and objects and panels to touch.
Some people are sensory seeking when they're having a difficult time. They want things that they can touch, and so things like weighted blankets, tactile toys that we can manipulate, or tactile items, things like the marble wall that you can touch. Other people may be sensory avoiding, and so things like headphones or sunglasses or low lights.
Local politician Mike Lake has flown with his son Jaden hundreds of times, and even with years of experience, it can be a lot for a person with autism.
For the most part, he thrives on kind of the excitement and everything around, and he's loving, even right now as we're talking, looking out at the airplanes and everything else. But then at times that gets a little bit overwhelming. The
Edmonton Airport Sensory Room is in the Departures Lounge and available to all travelers. Tyler, high time busy places like airports offer dedicated spaces to help minimize stress, anxiety of traveling.
Yeah, I mean, why not? I mean, it's hard to imagine an objection to such an initiative. So, I mean, I think it's generally a good idea. I do think broadly part of the larger problem here is that air travel has just become worse and worse and worse over the last 15 years or so. Airports are more crowded. The flying experience itself is a lot worse. It's much more expensive. Access to lounge spaces and things like that, even for frequent travelers, is less accessible than it once was. So this I think is an obvious and a good step for people who are struggling specifically. But the broader question of how to make air travel more pleasant, I think, still remains.
Ellen, for even the most seasoned of travelers, spending any length of time at an airport can take a toll. What do you make of the value of a calming environment?
Yeah, I think it's really great. I think it will help and support a lot of families that definitely would benefit from that. I hope that our costs don't go up because of it, wondering who's paying for it. Maybe a good sponsorship opportunity for an organization to look at some brand opportunity. And then also even thinking about bringing some of these objects onto the plane. So if people are having a hard time, or I was just traveling to Mexico and there was a young child who had a really hard sort of time and kind of broke down throughout the entire flight. So possibly having some of the little tactile applications on the plane as well could be a neat way to extend it into the actual flying experience.
Yeah. here's hope that it gets lots of use, and I'm to understand as well, other airports around the world starting to adopt this also. All right, we'll have to leave it there for time. Good to see you both. Hope you have an awesome weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.